New York mayoral elections are coming up next June. Joining us now is Zohran Mamdani, who's a candidate for election and New York State Assembly member. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, I remember covering your first race, part of this kind of DSA wave that kind of swept its way into power in New York City and across the state, and has kind of reshaped the politics in an interesting way. What gave you the idea to jump from there to running for mayor?
You know, the cost of living crisis, to be frank with you. New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs are struggling to afford even a shred of dignity in their lives. And Mayor Eric Adams has used almost every opportunity to exacerbate that crisis. He has raised rents on more than 2 million New Yorkers by 9%, rates we haven't seen since a Republican was running City Hall. He has supported Con Ed when they put in an application to raise New Yorkers' utility bills by about $70 a month. And he has sat on his hands whenever he's had the opportunity to provide any kind of relief. And this is a position that New Yorkers should look to as one that gives them respite from the economic crisis in the rest of their life, as opposed to one that is pouring gasoline on the fire that is already consuming them.
Now, it's also kind of an interesting position to be in as someone with your politics, where you have a lot of populism. And, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, also someone from the DSA wave, was posting on her Instagram over the last couple of days, asking people who voted for both her and Donald Trump, because she had some split ticket and some shifts in her own district towards Donald Trump, why they saw her, why they would vote for both her and for Donald Trump. If you're talking to a voter who, for example, would be someone maybe who voted for Donald Trump and would vote for you, what's your pitch to them? Even, talking about the cost of living crisis, something that is probably very serious for a lot of people who may have voted for Donald Trump. How are you having those conversations, basically, as a populist?
I actually spent much of Sunday on Hillside Avenue in Queens and Fordham Road in the Bronx, which were 2 of the areas in New York City that swung most towards Trump, saw even greater drop-offs of voting overall. And when I spoke to voters about why, they told me it was cost of living, that they remember having more money in their pocket 4 years ago, that they couldn't afford their groceries today. And it was despair over war and the genocide in Gaza, and a feeling that Donald Trump, as insincere as we know this to be, was the only candidate speaking to them about a desire for a more affordable life and bringing peace back to the world. And these are a lot of the issues, namely the economy and the inability to afford the price points that dominate people's day-to-day lives. And so when I spoke to those voters and I asked them, what would it take to bring you back to the Democratic Party? Because many of them had previously been voting for Democrats, and they said a focus on these very issues. And so I told them about my mayoral race and my opening promise to freeze the rent for every rent-stabilized tenant, to make buses fast and free for the more than 1 million New Yorkers who ride them every day, and to bring universal childcare into New Yorkers' lives, whether their child is 6 weeks of age or 5 years, because these are the price points that are pushing New Yorkers out of the city that they call home.
And so the movement that you've kind of come out of and been a leader of is kind of an entanglement of a couple of different currents. On the one hand, it's the Bernie Sanders. We're gonna make sure that you can afford your rent, your college, your groceries. You can make sure you can live a dignified life. And then there's the cultural elements of it, which became associated with a lot of it. Defund the police, abolish ICE, and on and on. When you talk to voters, where do they see kind of that wing of the party coming from? Do they associate it more with we're going to make people's material lives better, or do they associate it more with the other elements that Fox News will talk about and Democratic Party leaders will kind of condemn whenever there's some type of electoral problems for them?
I would say that Bernie is probably the figure that looms largest in voters' minds when thinking about the left wing of the party. And his response to Tuesday's election is one that has been found to be quite compelling to a lot of these very working class voters that I spoke to, which is a response that the Democratic Party left working class Americans a long time ago, and now working class Americans are leaving the Democratic Party. And I think that it is an association with an inability to afford those day-to-day expenses. And, I would also say that at the same time as nearly 500,000 New Yorkers, fewer New Yorkers voted for Harris than had voted for Biden 4 years ago, we also saw the passage of Prop 1, which was a proposal to enshrine reproductive rights and truly civil rights for all, including trans New Yorkers, passed at quite staggering margins across the state. And I think that this is also indicative of that passed across the country, which passed on issues that should be central to the Democratic Party. And yet voters trust referendums more than they trust Democrats. And it's time that we ask ourselves, why is that the case? And how can we deliver on those actual issues?
And in some sense, obviously, the rumor candidate Andrew Cuomo is the perfect foil to this left populism for all of the reasons. And you're in the state assembly, obviously very familiar with the Cuomo legacy in Albany. So in what sense, or how hard will it be, should he enter the race, to kind of get people's attention? Is it easier to get people's attention because he has so many obvious vulnerabilities politically, but he'll come in with a lot of built-in media, institutional knowledge within media organizations, an ability to sort of suck a lot of oxygen out of the room for himself? What's that dynamic going to be like for you if that happens?
I think Andrew Cuomo knows that the longer he's in this race, the more difficult it is for him. And that's why he's yet to announce his candidacy, because he doesn't want to expose himself to 4, 5, 6 months of an actual inspection of his record. He wants to simply coast on the reputation that he used public dollars to burnish, a reputation he was more interested in than actually saving New Yorkers' lives at the height of COVID. And what I am excited by is the opportunity to tell New Yorkers why we are in the situation we are in. When we're looking at a mental health crisis, here is the former governor who shut down so much of what would have been helpful in this moment to respond to these very crises. Here is the governor that cut hospital beds. Here is the governor that took an axe to almost every single kind of public institution he could find to ensure that it was not worthy of any funding in the future. And I think it's high time that he understands that accountability is a word that also applies to him.
Do you expect him to run as a Democrat or as an independent? Like, what are as people are gaming this out? What's your path to the Democratic nomination, and where does Cuomo fit into that?
I expect him to run as a Democrat, though I wouldn't put anything past Andrew Cuomo, because I think he's more interested in power than anything else. My path to the Democratic nomination is to speak to the working class of New York City. I say this as a socialist. I say this as someone who's running an unabashedly progressive campaign. There are far more New Yorkers who feel left out by the economic policies of Mayor Eric Adams and Democratic leadership than there are that identify with any one political persuasion. And my goal is to go to every single one of the 5 boroughs on a regular basis and to speak to those New Yorkers about how we could actually make their lives better. Not speak to them about values or ideas, but speak to them about tangible, deliverable policies that we can enact from the very beginning of a mayoralty that will literally make their life more affordable.
And how are you handling the crime question? Because this is one of the, Ryan kind of asked about this, but it's also, we've seen, like I've been talking to Ro Khanna a couple of times. We asked him about this actually on our show last week in California, New York, obviously. New Yorkers have some, concerns that are similar, just in a material sense, to what people in Northern California, Los Angeles have also been dealing with over the last couple of years. And a lot of people would point, voters might say, well, this is downstream of the defund the police movement, et cetera, et cetera. But just in conversations that you're having across the boroughs, there's obviously room between defund the police and reforming the police and all of that. So where's your conversation going when people bring those concerns to you?
Most of the time they bring it to me in the context of public transit. They feel the least safe when they're thinking about subways and buses and things of that nature. And I think it's important to identify that, because that means that the solutions to that feeling have to lie within those very places. And one of the reasons that we have been fighting for free buses is, I led and won the first New York City free bus pilot in last year's state budget, where we made 1 bus free in each borough. And what we saw is that by making that bus route free, assaults on bus drivers dropped by 38.9%. And these are the kinds of assaults that they are not just assaults on the driver, they are also assaults on the passenger's sense of safety in that moment. And if you're able to fundamentally transform the experience of getting on the bus, getting to where you're going, you feel that much more safe. And I think additionally, one of the reasons that many New Yorkers have identified feeling unsafe when they're taking the subway is the fact that the subway has become the de facto site of mental health crises across New York City. And it's critical that we actually understand that and respond to it in those very places. And what I mean by that is, at the same time as right now, where we have many vacant commercial units across the subway system, we could transform those vacant commercial units into mental health outreach centers. We could actually empower and create mental health responders so that the people that are responding to New Yorkers in crisis are not other New Yorkers or are not police officers, but are people trained specifically for that episode.
And what would that cost? What would that look like? Like, how would you develop that program?
So we're going to be putting forward a proposal to create a new department, the Department of Community Safety, which would build on the successes we've seen in Philadelphia's Hub for Hope program and policies that even the BART system has implemented around mental health responsiveness. And the cost is something that I'm quite confident will be within the costs we're already spending on police overtime, which nears about $1 billion every single year, or the Eric Adams proposal to spend $225 million on creating a new cop city in Queens. This is all possible within the fiscal sense. It's just a question of if there's the political will.
What about Rikers? It's still open. It's a complete travesty and a disgrace. Why hasn't Rikers been closed yet? And how would you get it closed?
I think it hasn't been closed because Eric Adams simply has no interest in closing Rikers Island. He has no interest in taking any kind of action beyond that of impunity when it comes to corrections, when it comes to policing. I have been to Rikers Island many a time. One of the last times I went to Rikers Island, an incarcerated New Yorker tried to take their own life in front of a colleague of mine. That is the level of despair we are talking about on this island. And it is a legal requirement to close Rikers Island in the next mayoral term. But Eric Adams speaks about the law as if it's a suggestion. So what I would do is from the very first day, I would make sure that we are following policies that make that legal requirement a reality, and that we actually close Rikers Island. We do so by ensuring that we are keeping New Yorkers safe. And just to the question of cost that has come up, it costs around $500,000 to have a New Yorker on Rikers Island, right? But we are only willing to spend about $50,000 sometimes to house those very New Yorkers, which would keep them out of that kind of a place. I think we have to realign our priorities.
One of the obstacles has seemed to be neighborhood opposition to alternatives to Rikers. Like, how do you overcome that?
I think one of the key things is there are a lot of people that we are throwing away, putting onto Rikers Island, that are actually need not be in that kind of a facility. They need not even be in a borough-based jail, frankly. And I think what we need to ask ourselves is, when there is a woman who is selling cotton candy outside of a school without a license, and the police put her in cuffs, and then she's visited by ICE the next day, do you feel safer that she is in a cell? And I think that that's what's so offensive about Eric Adams's policies, is they have nothing to do with sense. They only have to do with this sense of impunity on a day-to-day basis. And it stems across multiple agencies how we haven't been willing to create new solutions to problems that have continued through multiple mayoralities.
Yeah, it's wild what people are in Rikers for. Just sitting there for a year for having stolen like 10 newspapers out of a box, or like one guy I know with a sandwich. Like, just complete insanity. Anyway, Zohran, thank you so much for joining us. This is a race we'll be following pretty closely. It's gonna be interesting, no doubt.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
You got it.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.